Um, so my background is that I triple majored in math, physics, and economics from a small liberal arts college in Minnesota called Carleton. I then went to work in finance in the sales and trading division of Goldman Sachs. I quit at the peak of recession to then work for an innovation strategy consulting firm, where we did a lot of interesting work around figuring out, business and marketing challenges for different companies using mostly social scientific research. And one thing that became apparent during that time was that asking people questions limits our ability to understand why they make decisions. It was around the same time that I was introduced to our chairman, Dr. Silverstein, who I was hoping to be present with us today as well. Hopefully, we'll find him. And yeah, and he'd started Neuro-Insight in Australia. He's here now. It started the company in Australia, and it's taken it to the UK, and they were looking for someone to run the US market, which is when I met him, and he hired me as the CEO of Neuro-Insight, and it's been 5 years, 5 wonderful years.
Can you give me the basic principles of neuroscience research and how it might have evolved since when you first started?
Sure. So here's the basic premise of neuroscience research. The way the brain is structured, it's divided into left and right, and we all know it. And some very often commonly misused terminologies are like, oh, I'm so left brain, oh, I'm so right brain. That's quite inaccurate. But what is accurate is that the left side of the brain is the more rational side of the brain. That's where the verbal and speech centers sit. The right side of the brain is the more emotional side of the brain. And there's little to no direct connection between these two sides. So when you ask someone a question about how you feel, they actually end up responding, the left side of the brain where the speech centers sit, gets up and says, well, it's my responsibility, so I'm going to answer. So you end up getting an answer of how people think they feel, or how people think they should feel in this situation. Which can be accurate, or which can be completely inaccurate representation of the actual emotional state of the person. So that's one reason why, traditionally we haven't gotten to the right answer. Moreover, the past 5,000 years of Indian and Chinese philosophy, or Asian philosophy in general, and the past 100 years of Western neuroscience both point towards one common thing, which is that most of the processing that takes place in the brain takes place in the subconscious. And by definition of it being in the subconscious, you don't have access to it. So when that happens, again, traditional technologies such as asking people questions or giving them surveys haven't been able to get us to the right answer. So this is why studying neuroscience or looking at the brain becomes more important to get to the more accurate reasoning behind decision making. In terms of the evolution of neuroscience, I think there have been multiple initiatives in the past 5 years. The Obama government donated, multiple, I think, $1 billion within the general neuroscience research, not neuromarketing. There's been tremendous evolution in terms of the speed with which data is gathered, the accuracy of data gathered, the gadgets that are used to gather data. But I think overall the bigger impact has been that within the industry of neuromarketing, back in the day, there was a lot of what we call noise. Anybody could go on eBay and buy a headset for $169.99 and develop a software and claim to be a neuromarketing company. And what's happened in the past five years in the industry is that there's been a tremendous shakeout, where people who actually did not have any validation for their work or any reason to be in the industry were kind of kicked out because the industry just did not accept them because they could not prove their value. And whereas like 2 or 3 firms, one of them being ours, have really stood out in terms of the work that we produce and the link to actual sales and consumer behavior that we've seen. So that's been an evolution.
What type of data are you able to collect on a neuroscience basis, and are you able to collect them to form metrics and standardized metrics?
Yeah, so basically we have 5 metrics that we measure. The first one of which, and the most important one of which, is what we call long-term memory encoding. Now, memory is something that, when people talk about generally, and at least I will also say a bunch of our competitors till about 5 years ago used it as like, oh, this is a tertiary metric that we measure. The most important thing is emotion. And it makes for a very attractive sales pitch for me to walk into a room and tell people, hey, brands, you've been trying to connect with your consumer at an emotional level for a long time. And I'm going to now bring tools to help you measure emotion, thereby making your advertising fantastic. The answer is that is not as accurate as things may be. The one thing we have seen to be the biggest indicator of future consumer behavior is memory. Think about it this way. You and I are sitting here right now, and as humans we have, and as a journalist you have to be objective, but as humans we come to conclusions about people, certain judgments, how this person is dressed, he has a beard, how he speaks, he has brown skin. All of these things happen in your brain. But and that's emotion, and the valence of the emotion, the positivity or the negativity, is going to be how much you like me or dislike me. But what really matters is basically, by the end of this conversation, if my name or my company's name or the key message that I'm trying to deliver actually goes into your long-term memory encoding, is the only way that it's going to impact any of your future behaviors. So memory becomes not just a library for experiences you have in the past, but an insight for the things that you're going to do in the future. And we've actually gone ahead and validated these metrics in so many ways, where we have have scientific validation, where we've gone and peer-reviewed and published papers that correlate our metrics of memory with changing future consumer behavior. And then we've done commercial studies where we've actually validated our metrics to sales. So memory being the big one. The other metrics that we measure is engagement, which is a sense of personal relevance. We measure emotional intensity, which is the amount of emotion. We look at emotional valence, which is the positivity or the negativity of emotion. And we look at attention, visual attention. The way we get to different metrics is that different parts of the brain are responsible for different things, right? And it is not just our work, it is the past 100 years of neuroscience that tell us which part of the brain does what. And there's more or less a very solid agreement amongst neuroscientists across the world on what part of the brain does what. We just differentiate our technology in the way we measure it. We're still gathering data from the same part of the brain. So looking at what part of the brain does what, we translate it into the metrics that I mentioned. And obviously we've now worked for 10 years, so we've standardized them and have benchmarks across countries, across categories. And depending on what problem the client is trying to solve, we focus on one metric versus the other. So if you're trying to figure out whether my concept is relevant to the target audience, we look at the engagement metric. Whether you want to figure out whether my communication is going to lead to sales or not, we look at long-term memory and so forth.
Do you find that there are cultural differences internationally on a global basis with your 5 metrics?
100%. Now, it's a question that I'm asked many times, and it's a question that I always answer like this. What our metrics are giving us is how that target audience, that people that we tested on, are reacting to that stimulus. So if your question is that do brains in Brazil work differently and read differently on our metrics than brains in America in general, the answer is no. If you are asking me if you show the same content to someone in Brazil versus America, would the response be different? The answer is yes. So it's like a thermometer for the brain. If the guy in Brazil is reading the thermometer at 101, he's as sick as the guy in the US whose thermometer is reading 101. What may have caused him to have that temperature in his body may be 2 different things. So, but once it reads that, it means the same thing. So if we are seeing a certain kind of memory in Brazil versus America, it means that it is as well encoded in his memory in both places. So the brain as an organ is performing similarly, but what may cause it to do that would be different things. So yes, there are cultural differences in that way.
What type of accoutrements do you use to measure the brain? Some use gel caps, which may not replicate a real-life experience. How do you manage?
Yeah. So we have a cap and a set of visors that people wear. Now, if your question is it as natural as you sitting here and watching TV? The answer is no. Um, but one, we actually try to make it as non-invasive as something can be. So we use no gel. Came up with a way of testing this without actually using any gel. The only thing that we use are these soft felts that are wetted with water, which helps us in conductivity. So saline is what we use. So people, don't get offended by all of this gel in there. It's just water which dries off. So that's one. The second thing we make sure to actually test, and which is something that goes above and beyond what some of the traditional techniques use as well, is that even if we're testing a 30-second commercial, we bring people in and make them watch a half an hour TV show. And they are not bombarded with an ad as soon as they come in, or a clutter reel. To test that 30-second ad, we're testing a 30-minute TV show, and this ad would probably show up in the second ad break. So by the time you get to that ad, people are well accustomed to sitting there and viewing it as normally as they would otherwise.
Would you say there's an optimal combination of your 5 metrics that would indicate that this is really the best advertising campaign that an advertiser could create?
Well, if it's high on every metric, that'd be great. So we've, like I said, found different things to correlate with different things. So memory will correlate to sales. So if the objective is to single-handedly just increase sales, which is the point of most advertising, we look at memory specifically at the point of key messaging and branding. If you want to look at whether my ad went viral or not, whether people were sharing it or talking about it or not, we look at things like engagement, which is a sense of personal relevance, and emotional intensity. That also increases a lot of shareability. So whatever is your objective of your campaign, we would look at each metric. I stay away from saying that there's a one size fits all kind of solution, that do this and you'll be golden, because there are no such things in life.
Pranav, can you tell me about some recent studies that you have been conducting?
Sure. We just recently concluded a study with Facebook, which we were talking about at this conference. It was about the priming effect that TV has on TV, and the priming effect that Facebook has on TV. And are there ways for us to make our TV content more effective by priming it using other media, which I think is very relevant in today's world. We did another study that I'm presenting tomorrow with our client from Samsung, which looked at different ads that Samsung and some competitors had produced, and looked at 2 different sets of people. One who were loyalists to one brand, and the others who were loyalists to another brand. And looking at the way people communicate with these loyalists versus competitors, products, users, and what turns them on and what turns them off. And then how do you come up with an optimal strategy to put your brand out, to not just retain the consumers that you have, but also get a chunk of your competitors' business.
Can you talk a little bit about how your data results might mix in with the general data ecosystem?
Sure. I think our metrics gel really well with some of the behavioral data that you see in the market. In the validation studies that we've done, one of the big ones we did was with ThinkBox, which is a peak TV body in the UK, where they brought in Ubiquity, which is an econometric modeling firm. And what they were able to do was control for all other factors that you had within study, and they had 18 ads in 9 categories. In each category there were 2 ads, one that had done exceptionally well in the market in terms of sales, one that they hadn't done well in the market in terms of sales, and they had all of the factors be consistent. So the time of the economy it came out in, the amount of money spent on media, the amount of money spent on creative. And what they were able to see was that in 9 out of those 9 categories we were able to link our metrics to actual results that they saw in the market. Tomorrow, if you end up coming to the breakfast session, we've actually gone out of our way to correlate what we saw as the brain metrics around some of the Super Bowl ads, and gone ahead and tracked the social behavior around those ads, and show how we could have actually predicted and correlated our metrics to what we actually saw in the market. We could have saved these 4 brands a combined of $100 million had they, looked at this before.
How does the consumer benefit from all of this?
I think as consumers, we are bombarded with a lot of messaging through the course of the day. And what this does is allows the consumers to get messaging in a way where they can find it most productive. Our brains are trained to filter out things that we don't need, and take in things that we need. And with this, if a message is not relevant to you, it won't resonate with you anyway. It's just making the messages that could be relevant to you a little better in terms of resonating with you. So that's how the consumer benefits.
How does receptivity to a product factor into your measurement?
Oh, the brain's the ultimate organ to define that. If like, which is why we're highly sensitive to the target audience that we bring in to test the ads that we're testing on. We go out of a way to actually individually pick out these people who would be relevant to the brand, because if this is not relevant to you, or you're not even in the market for that, there's no point testing on you. So and we see huge differences. In fact, we see huge differences even within segments of people who are generally receptive to that. So, and we do a lot of work in what we call neuro-segmentation. So we've always segmented people across household income, across demographics around that. But if you get a large enough sample of people and test on them, what you may find are the other things that are common between some people, groups of people that you otherwise won't combine together, but make them more receptive to a certain kind of messaging or a brand. So if you and I, who are two different age demographics, genders, and races, and all of that, are fans of the same music band, we may actually be susceptible to be more receptive to a certain kind of brand or music or something like that.
What led you to neuroscience and this aspect of advertising effectiveness in neuroscience research?
Right. Well, if we go back in time, my original background was physics. And I then did my PhD in neuroscience. So I've always been interested in technology and developing techniques for measuring brain activity. And that's how we came across the SST methodology, which was used primarily in normal cognitive neuroscience, understanding how the brain achieves the everyday miracles we take for granted. Things like being able to recognize something, or being able to hold an image in your mind and rotate it, how the brain actually does that. And it struck me that this methodology could be useful commercially as well. Initially as a means of supporting the research institute that I'd founded at the university as well. But things have sort of developed on from there, and it's become autonomous in its own right. So I still keep a foot in both camps, but that's in fact how it arose.
Do you find that the neurological triggers, as it applies to advertising, changes over time? In other words, younger, children to young teens to young adults to older adults?
We haven't done much work on advertising in children. In fact, we have part of our ethical policy is that we do not work with children younger than the age of 14. So I can only sort of comment on age effects from there, but there certainly appear to be strong effects which are probably related to the issue of what people have been exposed to and are familiar with as well. So there are certain images, etc., that seem to trigger much more strongly younger groups. We did a study, for example, this is an obvious one, we did a study looking at, of all things, grey hair. It's strange for me talking about hair, but there we are. Looking at how people respond to the face of a young person if there's a bit of grey hair or not. And what we did was looked at images of these individuals, and we had young people, young, from about 18 to about 30, and older was 35 to about up to 60, etc. And what we found was that the appearance of some grey, say, from a female's perspective in a male image, tended to be associated with a reduced approach response, less likability for the young, but not for the older ones. They responded differently. That wasn't such a big deal, which is sort of what you'd expect. But certainly there are numerous age-related effects.
Oh, and so you've been studying and working in neuroscience for a long time. What do you see as the trends, the evolution and the future trends for this area?
Well, when I started, the neurosciences essentially belonged in either the scientific research lab or the clinic. And those are really the two areas where neuroscience found place. What we're seeing now is really very exciting, of neuroscience going beyond the clinic and the laboratory and making a contribution in the broader world of commercial communication, entertainment, broader range of education, for example. So these are really very exciting times, and the different technologies have different advantages. We feel that SST is uniquely suited to understand and to get a reliable measure of, for example, processes, things that are related to, say, what goes into long-term memory, which is crucial in terms of education, for example, but also commercial communication effectiveness. In terms of media, such as entertainment, engagement is the really important measure. And those measures occur when we record from different parts of the brain. So we're actually at the point of, I think, a period of dramatic growth in the neurosciences beyond the laboratory and the clinic.
So in terms of long-term memory, I think of teaching children propaganda when they're young. Is there any way of reversing the effects of negative propaganda against a group, for example, as that child ages, when they've been exposed to the stimuli for many years?
That's a very good question. Firstly, some of the most effective communication is or occurs when we are least aware of it, when our cognitive filters, if you will, are less engaged. The sorts of things that are there in the background that you're not actually paying selective attention to and critically evaluating can in fact be some of the most powerful effects. So to simply, among things, in terms of the communications, making people aware of what is happening, why these things are being said, etc., the purpose of it, is a mechanism which triggers this filter coming in, so that essentially you are more resistant to it. There are neurophysiological reasons I could discuss as to where are these filters in the brain, so to speak, and why are we so influenced by essentially the behavior of people around us. And it's related to the fact that humans are social beings. We evolved as groups. We needed, our behavior was influenced strongly by those around us. We needed to evolve regions of the brain which enable us to read the expression and the emotional state of others, etc. And that has a plus and a minus. The plus is that we can empathize, but the minus is we can be influenced by a range of messages which can have very negative consequences, particularly when empathy processes are intentionally switched off, which I think is what you're getting at.
Yes. And is there hope to change that over time, or are these long-term memories?
Oh, no, I think they can definitely be changed. I mean, surely we've seen examples of people who have taken one particular path earlier in their life, later coming along and in fact saying, no, I was, I no longer feel that way and for reasons. But we tend to think that if you present the reasons, people will follow the logic and come to the other point. But we now understand that communication is powerfully primed by the social context, the people around you, etc. So we need to take those things into account when we're passing these messages.
So does venue or the place and the company that you see a particular ad impact how your brain will function in receiving that ad? If you see a beer ad in a bar with a lot of fans in the context of a sports game, is that going to be different than if you're sitting alone in your living room?
The context is very important and is quite powerful. We've even seen subtler effects. So, for example, seeing a piece of entertainment where, for example, there's a watermark indicating what the network is. If that piece of entertainment is congruent with what you would have expected from that particular network, your response to it will be different to if it's incongruent. It's really quite a dramatic effect, which surprised us. That was actually more subtle. We thought, there can't be a mere watermark, are there? But you develop associations in a particular kind, things you expect in certain magazines, things you expect in certain channels, things you expect on NBC or Fox, will powerfully influence how you respond.
Well, so branding is important.
Yep.